On this channel, I've been asking the question whether anyone has ever given a demonstration of a psychic effect, like telepathy or clairvoyance. Some say no, never, at least nothing that's at all convincing. And it's true there's a lot of ambiguity around this. But there have been episodes that seem quite strongly suggestive of it, and I've given examples in other videos. Today I'm going to talk about seemingly telepathic contacts that happened between someone based in New York and another person who was traveling on a rescue expedition in northern Canada and Alaska, thousands of miles away. A rather striking real-world experiment. It's interesting because it was well documented, and the indications of telepathy seem so clear, at least to me, and I think to many other people as well. Just the kind of thing that might count as a demonstration of a psychic effect, in fact. Hello, my name's Robert. I'm a journalist and former editor of the Psi Encyclopedia, which describes scientific investigations of psychic phenomena. Link in the description. And if you find this interesting, do please click like and subscribe. It really helps. I'll get straight into the story, which concerns an Australian polar explorer named Hubert Wilkins, or Sir Hubert Wilkins as he'd become by this time. He was in the First World War as a pilot and photographer, was decorated for bravery, then took part in hazardous expeditions to the polar regions, which made him into something of a media celebrity. In the summer of 1937, he'd taken part in attempts to locate the crew of a Soviet aeroplane that had gone missing in the Arctic, which meant flying thousands of miles across the snowy wastes in a seaplane. The men hadn't been found, and he'd volunteered to carry on, flying a Lockheed Electra, similar to the one used by Amelia Earhart in her ill-fated around-the-world attempt the same year. But by now it was winter, and there was a strong risk that the same thing would happen to them if they were forced to land in some remote region. Now, as a boy growing up on a sheep farm in Australia, Wilkins had hung out with indigenous Australians, and they seemed sometimes to know of something that had happened in a distant place long before it became known by ordinary means. So he was open to the idea of psychic communication and said he'd experienced it himself. While planning the trip, he met up with Harold Sherman, a New York writer who himself had some psychic ability, and it occurred to Wilkins that they might set up some sort of a code, so that if he and his crew did get into trouble, he might telepathically reach out to Sherman to raise the alarm. For practice, they decided to sit down for half an hour at the same time in the late evening, a few times a week, and try to make contact, Wilkins sending Sherman his impressions of things that he'd been doing during the day. The expedition lasted for around 5 months, and in terms of its goal was a failure. The Russian airmen were never found. But as a psychic experiment, it was productive. Wilkins was usually too busy to sit down at the time they'd arranged, but he did get into the habit of directing his thoughts to Sherman throughout the day, and it seemed to work. From the start, when Sherman sat down for each session, he was amazed by the amount of stuff he seemed to be getting from Wilkins, just as if their two minds were in close contact. He says, "One impression followed another, almost without a break, as though I were a Western Union operator, taking down a series of messages being telegraphed to me by some distant sender." After each session, Sherman typed out his notes and gave them to a third party, an academic psychologist, so that no one could say that he'd simply fabricated them afterwards. When he and Wilkins later compared notes, they were astonished at how often his impressions matched, picking up things that Wilkins was thinking or doing. They then collaborated on a book, which was published 5 years later, with the title Thoughts Through Space, each giving a separate narrative of their activities. The expedition started in October, but the weather was bad and there were problems with equipment and supplies. So Wilkins and his team spent quite a lot of time hanging around, first in Canadian cities like Winnipeg and Edmonton, later in snowy settlements in the Arctic. And it was only in March that they were able to carry out actual searches. At first sight, the images that Sherman received appear quite repetitive around certain themes. Wilkins meeting with local people, his anxieties about lack of equipment or its shortcomings, frustration at the delays, and then, of course, lots of impressions of the frozen landscapes and so on, all of which one might think are general, perhaps just produced by Sherman's imagination. One day in December, he writes of seeing a little settlement on ice, cluster of huts and tents. From what I take to be south, you look off to stretches of low, bleak, snow-covered land. About a rescue flight, he writes about feeling as if he's in the plane with Wilkins, passing quite low over shaggy white and shadowy peaks, seeing the herds of caribou below. On another day, when the plane was experiencing extreme turbulence, he feels a sense of danger, looking down into deep pockets or valleys filled with snow and ice. Now, these impressions did match what Wilkins was experiencing at the time, but from our point of view, evaluating them as telepathy, they seem quite general, the kind of thing Sherman might have picked up by intuition. But mixed with generalities are a lot of very specific things that turned out to correspond exactly with what Wilkins said he was experiencing at that particular time, that would have been true for that day, but rarely for any other day. Here's an example from early in the expedition. One of Wilkins' first stops was in Winnipeg, where Sherman picked up various impressions of his activities. Sherman's notes for that day start with this: "You communicated Russian government today regarding some flight matter." That evening, Wilkins had received a call from an official at the Soviet embassy in Washington, and he gave him an update of his progress. Sherman goes on, "Weather still mild. Kenyon, who is one of Wilkins' team, reports plane ready. Impatient. Wheels come to my mind. Cannot figure connection." In fact, there was a connection. They were annoyed because they'd been expecting snow and had been planning to swap the wheels of the plane for skis, which they'd need once they got to the far north, to test them and be sure they were working. Then Sherman writes, "You in place near a lot of people. I hear music, talk. You were talking animatedly with group. Several women present. Oh yes, I hear you say to someone, as though you were trying to beg off an engagement, 'Well, not tonight.'" That evening, Wilkins had got into a lively discussion at a dinner party. He'd left early, apparently to the annoyance of his hostess, who kept ringing him up at his hotel to try to get him to go back, which he didn't want to do. On another day, Sherman's notes mentioned some equipment packed with poles, and it happened that just on that day, Wilkins had been shopping for bamboo poles for making lightweight tents. Sherman says, "Someone seems to pin or put something on the lapel of your coat, pins a medal or token of some kind." He then adds, "Someone gives you a cigar." Earlier that day, Wilkins had attended a ceremony where he'd been awarded a badge of honor by the city, and this was publicly pinned on his coat. And on the way to the airport, he was presented with a box of cigars, so that detail was correct as well. The most striking matches are the ones that are quite unexpected, when Sherman picked up something that Wilkins was doing or thinking that didn't seem to fit. One time, Sherman writes, "You in company, some women, evening dress, social occasion, important people present, much conversation. You appear to be in evening dress yourself." The last thing he'd expected. But again, it was accurate. That evening, Wilkins had been pressed to attend a formal ball, against his will, as it meant having to wear evening dress, which of course he didn't have and had to borrow. It was too tight around the waist, and he was embarrassed by the whole thing. On a later date, when Wilkins was in the far north, Sherman seemed to see a crackling fire, get definite fire impressions as though house burning. You can see it from your location. Impression persists it is a white house burning and quite a crowd gathered around it. Wilkins says that he heard the fire alarm ring at precisely the time Sherman had arranged to be sitting in his office to try to receive impressions. He went to the window and saw a house on fire, flames engulfing the roof and people running around and shoveling snow onto it. Fires were rare in this settlement. There'd only been one in the last 7 years, so this was an unusual thing for Sherman to have picked up. Some things seemed completely out of context. In one session, Sherman got an impression of a diamond mine, which made no sense to him, but he wrote it down anyway. And it turned out to be a match. That day, Wilkins had been talking with some people about his experiences at the diamond mines of South Africa, telling how he'd been given a piece of framesite, which is a rare rock containing tiny diamonds. Another time, Sherman writes, "Endorsement of some advertised product. Seem to see liquor bottle, which has been requested of you. Believe you acting upon offer, make decisions this day." A few days earlier, Wilkins had received a message asking him to promote a whiskey brand. He'd asked for more money, and on the day of Sherman's comment was told the fee had been increased, but he thought it still wasn't enough, and he decided not to do it. Okay, so the book lists a total of 68 separate sessions documented over a period of several months, and there are typically around 4, 5, or 6 impressions in each one, so a total of roughly 300. There's a mix of hits and misses, and also some that might be hits, but you can't be sure weren't the result of intuition and logical inference. And of course, if you think telepathy doesn't happen, then that's what you naturally think. Wikipedia cites John Booth, a stage magician who'd mentioned the episode in a debunking book, saying it was more likely that the successes were the result of coincidence law of averages, subconscious expectancy, logical inference, or a plain lucky guess. And of course, these are the sorts of general ideas that we can apply. But here they'd be stretched. Some of the hits are so remarkable. The evening dress incident and the burning house, for instance, on the exact days that these things happened. They're difficult to dismiss as random coincidences. Or we could object that it wasn't scientific, done in controlled conditions. And it's true, it wasn't set up as a formal scientific experiment with a report stating predictions and describing methods and outcomes. But it was controlled in the sense that Sherman sent the notes of his impressions to an independent person after each session, so he couldn't have fabricated them afterwards. And there was distance between them, sometimes as much as 3,000 miles, and they were hardly ever in direct contact, so there was virtually no chance of Sherman picking up by any normal means what Wilkins was thinking and doing on a daily basis. Of course, the ideal for science, the sort of gold standard really, is to make the process completely objective so that every aspect of it can be measured and analyzed. And that applies in spades with a claim as challenging as direct mind-to-mind communication. But the fact is, and I think it is a fact, that if telepathy is going to happen at all, it's most likely to be in these sorts of natural situations. Everything here was in its favor. Two people who both have some natural psychic ability and are eager to demonstrate it, and a really intense ambience, with the person whose thoughts are being picked up in a more or less constant state of stress and tension, particularly when risking his life. It's this sort of unpredictable spontaneity that seems to encourage telepathy, where there's real urgency and purpose, and that's almost entirely missing when you're trying to generate it artificially in a laboratory setting. So was this telepathy? And if so, should we be paying more attention to it? I'll be glad to know what you think, so do leave a comment and check out some of my other videos on these topics. Links in the description, and I hope I'll see you there.